Welcome to this video. My name is Bob Reed, and I work for ACER, that's the Association of Colleges in the Eastern Region. And in this screencast I'd like to look back at the key ideas and activities that we covered in the workshop that I delivered at the RAPAL conference earlier this year in Birmingham. In the workshop I look back at some projects I've been involved in the last couple of years in the health and social care sector. And those projects sometimes involve me working with senior care workers in residential care homes. Another project involved me in working with nurse lecturers at the University of Essex. And in the workshop I looked at different ways, different resources and training activities I had used with senior care staff and senior nurse lecturers in helping them understand social practice theories of literacy and numeracy, because they were all keen to offer embedded support with English and maths, and I thought it would be useful to explore the extent to which I could help them understand a social practice view in very practical ways. And so in the workshop I looked back at the resources that I used and tried to make the link between theory and practice. I actually started the workshop by getting participants to do an activity that I often use with senior care workers, which was a ranking activity. I asked them to look at 7 care notes and to sequence them to reflect their fitness for purpose, how appropriate they were in terms of their use of language. Now, this activity has never failed to prompt a lot of lively discussion amongst senior care workers. What they end up talking about, obviously, is the way those care notes are written, the use of abbreviations, whether or not they should be used or not, the choice of content, the element of opinion, the need to focus on fact, and it really brings out to them how much they know about the way those care notes should be written in response to their particular purpose and audience. Now, that activity I used to highlight 2 key insights into literacy development, and this is the first. And it's obviously the fundamental insight that underpins social practice theory, which is that we get better at reading and writing by working alongside experienced practitioners. This is the slide that I often use when working with care lecturers or senior care workers, that highlights the important role that they have in sharing their literacy practices with their students. During the workshop I tried to make regular links between the practical resources I was demonstrating and some of the more academic aspects of social practice theory, and this was one of the slides from James Ballgee that I used, which highlights the way in which we are socialised into literacy practices within a community of practice. The second key insight that I tried to bring out from the feedback discussion following the ranking activity is this one, which is, again, it's another key idea that underpins social practice theory, that we get better at reading and writing all the way through our lives. And to some extent this runs counter to the common sense view that senior care workers often have about literacy development. They often think that we are all taught to read and write at school, and that's when our literacy development ends. But in fact, social practice theory encourages us to view the way in which we develop those practices all the way through our lives as we take on new roles and new responsibilities. I then talked about my work at the University of Essex, which involved working with Ian Keenan, a very experienced nurse and a nurse lecturer, and someone who really understands the implications of social practice theory. And in offering study skills support to his trainee nurses, he often uses activities similar to the one that I showed you earlier. This one on the slide, you can see an example of a health assessment screening form, and Ian had made up a ranking activity that he gets his trainee nurses to do, and that gives him an opportunity to discuss with his nurses how he, as an experienced nurse, would complete those forms and then read the forms that others have completed. And what's really interesting in doing those sessions with Ian is to see the very specific literacy practices that he shares with his trainee nurses that only he can share. There's obviously a time for those nurses to have specialist support with literacy, but there's also a time for Ian himself to share his wealth of experience in how those documents are completed. And his work is an excellent example of the way social practice theory can be put into place, really, in terms of study skill support. And to finish off the literacy element of our RAPAL workshop, I talked very briefly about the work of Cope and Calancis and their view of literacy development, literacy teaching, which underpins the practical examples that we had just seen, really, which is about situated practice, about shared reading and writing activities to identify key language features, so that students become more aware of how those texts are written and can construct those texts for themselves. And on a more practical note, to finish off our literacy element of the workshop, I shared with participants a one-side of A4 handout which summarised some key practical tips on embedding that I often use with senior care workers and care lecturers. Very practical tips about how to embed support with reading, but all of them, I would say, informed by some key insights from social practice theory. In the second half of the workshop, I had an opportunity to talk much more fully about my work at the University of Essex and with Ian, and I asked participants to look at 3 calculations all relating to the maths that nurses might need to undertake. This slide shows the 3 calculations that I asked participants to have a look at. They all related to how you work out a dosage, and on the next slide we'll have a look at one of them in more depth. Here you can see one of those 3 calculations. It's one of the more difficult ones. Stock vials of tramadol hydrochloride contain 100 mg in 2 ml. A patient requires 80 mg. How much is actually given? So I asked participants to think about how they would set about doing that maths calculation themselves, how nurses might do it, and what are some of the difficulties that they might encounter. In the feedback discussion following that task, it was really interesting to explore the different ways in which people tackled those calculations, and I took people very quickly through what is often considered to be the traditional way in which those calculations are solved, which often involves doing a little fraction problem. When I was working with nurses, I adopted an idea I picked up from a colleague in London who was working in supporting nurses with maths, and he used a little mnemonic, NHS, which sums up the little fraction calculation that nurses often have to do. What you need to do is to put the amount you need over what you have and then multiply it by the stock amount. So in the terms of our example, we could see that we need 80 mg. We put it over the amount that we have, which is 100, and then multiply it by the 2 ml. Then when we cancel down, we get 4/5 times 2, which is 8/5, which is 1 3/5, which is equal to 1.6 ml. Now that's quite a complex calculation, and for many students the manipulation of those fractions can be very difficult. And what was interesting in the workshop was to share with participants other ways in which that calculation can be done, and in fact other ways in which nurses actually do that calculation in the real world. In the rest of the workshop, I then shared with participants some ideas that I gained from Kerry Wright, who's the nurse lecturer at the University of Greenwich, and which she explores in her book Drug Calculations for Nurses. I also mentioned another book by Diana Coben that mentions the importance of bearing in mind the practical ways in which nurses use maths in everyday life. And so in the next slides we'll look at 2 contrasting ways in which we can offer support with maths. On this slide I presented a view of doing a drug calculation using a syringe as a number line, and this is an an idea that Kerry Wright presents very powerfully in her book. And if I just step you through, this is a calculation that we did actually in the workshop, and it would take me longer to talk you through this, but the key point is that in using the syringe as a number line, we are making links to the workplace practices of the nurse, to the calibration of the syringe and to the equipment and to the drugs that they're using, which is in complete contrast to the more abstract algorithm of the fraction question that we saw, the fractional method that we saw earlier. So we're trying to reflect in our classroom teaching a social practice view of numeracy. I then step people through another calculation using the syringe as a number line, and trying to make the point that we're trying to build links between what goes on in the classroom and what goes on on the ward, in the workplace. And that's not to denigrate or to avoid teaching fractions, but it's to recognise the importance of first validating and building on the informal numeracy practices that learners bring with them from their placement into the classroom, and by building on those we can more successfully help them progress onto fractional methods. On this slide I then went through a critique of the traditional nursing formula, which reflects a lot of the ideas that Kerry Wright has expressed in her papers on her work in exploring her particular approach to nursing calculations. I'll leave you to have a look at those in more detail later, but they do emphasise the value of exploring a social practice approach that really bears in mind what it is nurses do in the workplace, and looking at what they can learn in the workplace and what they can learn in the classroom, and making a link between those two areas. So making that link between the classroom and placement was really crucial for us in our work at University of Essex. Again, as I said, building very much on Kerry Wright's excellent work. So towards the end of the workshop I tried to summarise for participants what it is student nurses could pick up, what they could learn out in the workplace in terms of maths, and what they could learn in the classroom, and how important it is to try and make links between those two areas. At the end of the workshop I mentioned to participants who wanted to find out more that Ian and I had written a project report, and you should also have a link to that report in the RAPAL journal. If you'd like to find out more about our work together at the university, or the work I talked about earlier about supporting senior care workers, please don't hesitate to get in touch.